What would you do if a child you'd never met screamed, "Don't eat that," in the middle of a high-end restaurant? Sounds like the start of a wild story, doesn't it? Well, that's exactly what happened when a scrappy homeless boy interrupted the quiet elegance of an upscale dining experience to save a man's life. But here's the twist. His warning wasn't just random, it uncovered a shocking secret that no one saw coming. Betrayal, courage, and a moment that changed everything. This story will leave you questioning how far you'd go to do the right thing. Stay with us, because what happens next is nothing short of extraordinary. The restaurant was a picture of elegance, with its polished floors, soft murmurs of conversation, and the tantalizing aroma of freshly baked bread wafting through the air. Ricardo Albuquerque sat at the center table, exuding quiet authority. His tailored suit and gold-rimmed glasses reflected a life of immense success, yet his movements were unhurried, almost heavy. Across from him sat Natalia, his much younger wife, a vision of sophistication with her impeccable makeup and diamond bracelet glinting under the light. But her smile didn't quite reach her eyes as she absently scrolled through her phone. It was a scene that whispered luxury, but hinted at something amiss. Outside the restaurant's ornate gates stood Matthew, a weary boy wrapped in an oversized hoodie that had seen better days. His dark eyes darted from table to table, not out of mischief, but a hunger that gnawed at both his stomach and his spirit. He wasn't just looking for food. He was searching for something more elusive: hope. The boy's gaze locked on Ricardo's table, drawn to the steaming bowl of soup and fresh bread that seemed like a feast from another world. Yet, even as he watched, he noticed something strange, something that made his heart race. Natalia's hand moved with practiced grace as she reached into her designer bag and retrieved a small vial. Her movements were subtle, almost imperceptible to anyone not paying attention. But Matthew saw it all: the way she tilted the vial over Ricardo's soup and stirred it with an air of nonchalance. His breath caught in his throat as doubt turned to certainty. This wasn't right. The weight of what he had just witnessed bore down on him like a storm cloud. Should he stay silent? After all, who would believe a scruffy kid like him? Yet something deep inside him refused to let this moment pass unnoticed. And so, with trembling resolve, he prepared to act, setting the stage for what would become an unforgettable confrontation. Matthew's sharp eyes didn't miss a thing, not even the smallest details. From his spot outside the restaurant, he watched as Natalia's hand slid into her designer bag with an elegance that seemed almost rehearsed. The small vial she produced glinted in the sunlight, its contents clear and unassuming. But what followed sent a chill down Matthew's spine. The liquid disappeared into Ricardo's steaming soup with a quick swirl of her spoon, as if it had never been there. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but not to him. Sometimes life shows you things you wish you hadn't seen, but once you do, there's no going back. His heart pounded like a drum in his chest as he crouched behind the restaurant's iron gate, trying to process what he'd just witnessed. Could it really be true? Could someone who exuded such grace and charm be capable of something so sinister? Natalia leaned toward Ricardo, her voice low but laced with something cold and calculating. Matthew couldn't hear every word, but the tone was enough to make his stomach churn. He felt paralyzed by the weight of his discovery. After all, who would believe him a street kid with nothing to his name over someone like her? But then he saw Ricardo lift the spoon to his lips, and instinct took over. Without thinking, Matthew pushed himself up from his hiding spot and burst through the restaurant gates. His voice cracked as he yelled, "Don't eat that." Heads turned. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. For a moment, time seemed to freeze as all eyes locked on the scruffy boy standing at the center of this polished world. In that instant, Matthew wasn't just a kid anymore. He was someone willing to risk everything for what was right. And sometimes that's all it takes to change the course of events. The restaurant, once filled with the gentle hum of conversation and the clinking of fine china, fell into an eerie silence. All eyes were on Matthew, the boy who had dared to disrupt this world of privilege. His voice, though shaky, carried a conviction that pierced through the disbelief in the room. "She put something in your soup," he repeated, his words hanging in the air like a thunderclap. Natalia's face hardened as she rose from her chair, her polished demeanor cracking under the weight of scrutiny. "How dare you accuse me?" she hissed, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. But no amount of indignation could erase the doubt that had begun to creep into Ricardo's mind. Ricardo's hand trembled as he placed his spoon back into the bowl, his gaze shifting between Matthew and Natalia. The boy's ragged appearance stood in stark contrast to Natalia's refined elegance, yet there was something raw and undeniable in his plea. The murmurs among the diners grew louder, a symphony of suspicion and curiosity. Natalia's attempts to dismiss Matthew as a liar only added fuel to the fire. "He's just a street kid looking for attention," she snapped, but her words lacked their usual authority. Ricardo leaned back in his chair, his piercing eyes narrowing as he studied his wife. "What's going on here, Natalia?" he asked quietly, his voice laced with an edge that silenced even her. The tension reached its peak when the police arrived, their presence adding a new layer of gravity to the unfolding drama. Natalia's composure shattered completely as they approached the table. Her protests turned frantic, her voice rising in desperation as she tried to explain herself. But it was too late. The weight of Matthew's words and Ricardo's growing doubts had already tipped the scales. As one officer carefully collected the soup for testing, another turned to Natalia with a question that froze her in place. "Do you have anything to confess?" Her silence spoke volumes before she finally broke down, her confession spilling out like poison from a cracked vial. And just like that, the truth was laid bare for all to see. The air in the restaurant grew heavier as Natalia's polished mask began to crumble. Her sharp denials turned into stammered excuses, and the once confident woman now seemed cornered, her gaze darting around the room like a trapped animal. Under the weight of Ricardo's piercing stare and the murmurs of the onlookers, she finally broke. "Fine," she spat, her voice trembling with frustration and resentment. "Yes, I did it. I couldn't take it anymore, his control, his power. I wanted it all to end." Her words echoed through the room, leaving everyone stunned. Sometimes the truth doesn't set you free, it exposes you. Ricardo's face was a canvas of disbelief and betrayal. For a man who had built an empire by reading people and anticipating their moves, this revelation struck him to his core. He sat back in his chair, his hand trembling slightly as he pushed the bowl of soup away. The diners whispered among themselves, their shock palpable. Natalia's confession wasn't just an admission of guilt. It was a window into a marriage that had been rotting from within. It was a stark reminder that appearances could be deceiving and that even the most glittering lives often hid shadows. As the police moved in to arrest Natalia, her composure shattered completely. She screamed and struggled, her voice filled with venom as she hurled accusations at Ricardo and insults at Matthew. But her words fell on deaf ears. The truth had already been laid bare for all to see. Matthew stood silently nearby, his small frame still but unyielding, like a tree weathering a storm. Ricardo's gaze shifted to him, and for the first time that evening, gratitude softened his expression. The boy who had nothing had just saved everything: Ricardo's life, and perhaps even his soul. And with Natalia led away in handcuffs, a new chapter was about to begin. As the restaurant slowly returned to its usual rhythm, Ricardo sat in silence, his mind reeling from the events that had just unfolded. The betrayal by Natalia was a wound he hadn't anticipated, but amidst the chaos, there was a light, a boy who had risked everything to save a stranger. Ricardo's gaze softened as he looked at Matthew, the scruffy kid who had stood firm against doubt and disbelief. "You saved my life," Ricardo said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. It wasn't just gratitude. It was an acknowledgement of something deeper, the courage it took for Matthew to act when no one else would. Matthew shifted uncomfortably in his seat, unused to such attention. I couldn't let it happen," he murmured, his voice barely audible. Ricardo studied him carefully, seeing beyond the tattered hoodie and tired eyes to the strength and determination that lay beneath. "Most people would have looked the other way," Ricardo said, leaning forward. "But you didn't. That takes a kind of bravery money can't buy." Matthew's cheeks flushed slightly, and he looked down at his hands. For so long, he'd been invisible to the world around him. But in this moment, he wasn't just seen, he was valued. Ricardo made a decision then and there, one that would change both their lives forever. He reached into his pocket and made a call, arranging for Matthew to have a safe place to stay and opportunities to rebuild his life. "This is just the beginning," Ricardo said with a small smile as he ended the call. Matthew's eyes widened in disbelief. "You don't have to do this," he said quickly, his voice tinged with both gratitude and hesitation. But Ricardo shook his head. "I do," he replied firmly, "because you reminded me of something important today, that even in the darkest moments, there's still hope." And with that, an unlikely bond was formed between two people from completely different worlds, proof that kindness and courage can bridge even the widest gaps. Life has a way of testing us in the most unexpected moments, doesn't it? One minute, you're just trying to get through the day, and the next, you're faced with a choice that could change everything for yourself and for others. That's what happened to Matthew. A boy who had every reason to look away, to mind his own business, chose instead to step up. He didn't have wealth or power. He didn't even have a home. But he had courage, the kind of courage that reminds us all of what truly matters. Think about it. How often do we ignore the small voices around us? How often do we dismiss those who seem insignificant? Yet, it was Matthew, the boy no one noticed, who saved a life and uncovered a truth that no one else dared to see. His bravery reminds us that doing what's right often comes at a cost, but the reward is far greater than we can imagine. It's a lesson in humanity, in standing firm when it's easier to walk away. And isn't that something we all need to remember? So, let me ask you, when was the last time you stood up for something you believed in? When was the last time you listened to your instincts, even when the odds were against you? If this story moved you, take a moment to reflect on how your actions, no matter how small, can create ripples of change. And if you want more stories like this, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Let's keep learning, growing, and inspiring each other. After all, the world needs more Matthews, don't you agree?